You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.
Hi everyone, this is John Mandrola from theheart.org Medscape Cardiology, and this is This Week in Cardiology for July 13th, 2018. This week, I'm talking appropriateness of ICD therapy, blood pressure, vitamin use, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, or NSAIDs, and spending at end of life. So the first topic is about the appropriateness of ICD use and our Department of Justice investigation. In 2010, due to whistleblower allegations of ICD overuse, the DOJ launched a nationwide investigation into the use of ICDs outside the national coverage decision. When the ICD trials made it to and Scott Heft found benefit in selected patients with heart failure and left ventricular dysfunction, Medicare, the government payer, had to cover ICDs. But due to the expense of the devices and their potential harm, the government payers set strict criteria. And this criteria is called the NCD, or National Coverage Decision. And part of the NCD criteria had to do with the timing of the ICD. It was illegal to bill Medicare, which was essentially fraud if you did, if an ICD was implanted within 40 days of an MI or 90 days of a revascularization procedure like PCI or CABG. Now, these timing rules were in place because they were the entry criteria of RCTs and because numerous studies had showed no ICD benefit when devices were used early, after PCI, after MI, or after CABG. The DOJ investigation caused many hospitals to launch audits of their ICD use and importantly, their documentation of ICD indications in the chart. And then, in 2011, review of the NCDR database by Duke researchers confirmed that there was a problem. They found that 22% of ICDs implanted between 2006 and 2009 were implanted outside the NCD criteria and basically had timing violations. So the Department of Justice then allowed hospitals to pay back any monies that their own internal audits determined to be questionable. Hospitals had to make a risky judgment. Do they pay back the money for ICDs placed outside of the NCD criteria, or do they risk having an audit by the DOJ? And if the DOJ found that an ICD was put in outside criteria, then the recoup monies were actually tripled. So many hospitals decided to settle, and millions of dollars were paid back. Many of us practitioners, me included, who practiced during this time, felt the effects of the DOJ investigation. And in short, ICD implant volume decreased by a lot. And every single ICD was audited before implant. That was a new finding. We didn't do that before the DOJ. And documentation for ICDs now has to be pristine. So this is the background for a recent study published in JAMA that examined the association of the DOJ investigation and changes in the percentages of ICDs meeting or not meeting criteria between a 8-year period between 2007 and 2015. Now, the interesting twist of this study was that researchers also looked at the differences in hospitals that settled versus those that did not. The authors used data from the NCDR registry, and participation in this registry was also a mandatory NCD criteria for ICD reimbursement. The study included about 300,000 ICD implants at 1,800 hospitals. The authors found an immediate and rapid 2-year decline in ICD implants outside of NCD criteria after the DOJ investigation. This decline was greater in hospitals that settled with the DOJ. A second and perhaps more notable finding from this study was that overall primary prevention ICD implant volume dropped over the study period, significantly more at settlement hospitals. And this decline in implant rates occurred in the setting of more hospitals coming on and implanting devices. Now, the authors also looked at secondary prevention ICDs, and these remained unchanged. So my comments are numerous. First, an obvious observation is that, yes, the DOJ investigation strongly associated with the decline in outside NCD criteria implants. And the timing of this is such that it's hard not to say that it actually caused the decrease. Now, the more provocative finding is the association of declining primary prevention ICD implants overall. Some experts have worried that an unintended consequence of the investigation is that it may have led to ICD underuse. Dr. Paul Heidenreich, writing in an editorial, compared the rising rates of ICD use in Germany over the same time period at the same time as in the U.S., ICD rates were declining. So going up in Germany, going down in the U.S. However, ICD underuse, in my opinion, is unlikely, as there are other causes of ICD implant decline. So there's a smaller pool of patients with cardiomyopathy after the period of time where they've all been put in. Remember that when the trials came out, there was this huge pool of patients with ischemic cardiomyopathy that didn't have ICDs. And far fewer new ischemic cardiomyopathy cases occur now because of more access to acute PCI for STEMI. Now, there were positive changes that came from the DOJ investigation, and one is a much-awaited change in the NCD criteria. For instance, now there are exceptions to the waiting period. For instance, if a patient is in the waiting period and has a pacing indication and an ICD indication, you can go ahead with the ICD. Now, Dr. Heidenreich also suggested the possibility of more scrutiny of cardiac usage in the future. He noted that the whistleblowers in the ICD case did not just see firsthand overuse in their labs, they actually saw overuse in the data. I actually didn't know that. I thought it was just whistleblowers from a lab, but it's actually whistleblowers looking at big data. So more and more big data will likely be used to monitor use of more mundane procedures like cardiac imaging, for instance. And finally, is that during this era, after the trials, there was massive overuse of ICDs and often inadequate pre- and post-implant patient information and consent. The literature, if you go and look at it on ICD decision quality, is embarrassing. Now, these trends during this time period were likely due to the irrational exuberance and extension of the ICD to patients unlike those who were enrolled in the trial. We've improved a lot, no doubt, but still we have a ways to go in terms of recognizing the importance of comorbidity. For instance, ICD benefits people who are otherwise healthy and whose greatest risk is arrhythmic risk. So I look forward to a future where ICD education gets better. Second topic is about triaging blood pressure. Now, the recent blood pressure guidelines and the controversy surrounding them has really rejuvenated my interest in office blood pressure measurements. As an AF doctor in one of America's least healthy states, I see a lot of patients with hypertension. Now, that's one fact. The other fact is that I don't like prescribing pills. And the third fact is that point measurements of blood pressure in the office may not well represent the actual blood pressure readings of a patient. And one of the things I've done more of lately is used ambulatory blood pressure. Not so much formal testing, but I have a patient get a cuff and measure their home blood pressures, write it down, and get a more spread out sort of average measure. Often the blood pressures are lower when patients take them at home. The problem with this is that it increases the workload of being a patient. So that's why an interesting study from British and Canadian authors published in British Medical Journal, or BMJ, caught my eye. They tested an algorithm called proof blood pressure to triage patients with suspected hypertension who may benefit from ambulatory blood pressure monitoring. Now, the algorithm, which I sampled online, you can actually use it online as an online tool, uses a mean of 3 blood pressures, the status of hypertension, BMI, cardiovascular history, and gender. And there's 3 outputs of this algorithm. One is you definitely normal blood pressure. 2 is definitely hypertension. And the third is it's unclear, so maybe do ambulatory blood pressure monitoring. So the main outcome of this study was the proportion of patients whose blood pressure status was classified correctly using the algorithm strategy. And they found that the algorithm accurately classified a hypertensive status in most and resulted in about a 50% reduction in the need for doing ambulatory blood pressures. I'm going to try this in the office. Also, if there's any hypertension gurus out there listening, please consider leaving a comment on the website. I'm really interested in this topic. Third topic today is about vitamins. Now, I see this a bunch. An overweight sedentary patient with a medicine list that includes a multivitamin or many vitamins. And I'm getting tired of rehashing the multitude of studies showing no benefit from taking vitamins. Well, now, recently, another study, but this one, a huge systematic review and meta-analysis published in Circ Outcomes, finds no scientific evidence that multivitamins promote cardiac health. And the review included 18 studies with over 2 million participants, and the hazard ratios all hovered around 1.0. And after adjustment, and when using only RCTs, there was no subgroup of patients that benefited from multivitamin use. My friend Vinay Prasad, an oncologist but also an expert in methodology, wrote an excellent accompanying editorial. I'd recommend reading his editorial not so much to help understand how vitamins are not beneficial, but to learn about the pitfalls of observational nutritional epidemiology. Vinay and his co-author Alison Haslam discussed the effects of picking what variables to adjust for. The point being that these choices are one, numerous, two, variable, and therefore can result in thousands of potential models of association. And they call this as a resultant of vibration of effects, meaning some adjustments show protective effects, others show harm, and this, they write, illustrates the problem with doing multiple hypothesis testing. So observational data in general has a role, but placing too much emphasis on it can lead to problems, and medicine is replete with examples of RCTs overturning practices that were based on only observational data. And finally, the other reason to highlight the vitamin study is because it's important for us as health advisors to help patients avoid being distracted by vitamins. Rather than pay for and swallow vitamins, it's better to stop drinking sugary drinks or exercise or do other things that we know provide health benefits. Fourth topic today is nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, or NSAIDs. One of the most frequent questions that comes up in the office is the treatment of arthritic pain, usually because of the concerns over NSAIDs in patients who are already taking an antithrombotic drug, say, for instance, anticoagulants for AFib. My views on this matter have significantly changed. But first, a study published in JACC addressed the relevant issue of NSAID use in patients with AFib who take a DOAC. This was a post hoc observational analysis of the RELY study, which pitted dabigatran versus warfarin. Remember, in the original RELY study, dabigatran 150 milligrams was better than warfarin at reducing strokes and had similar rates of bleeding. And this sub-study looked back at nearly 3,000 of the 18,000 total patients who used NSAIDs at least once during the trial. And the results are not surprising. The NSAID use increased the risk for major bleeding. GI bleeding in particular was almost double with NSAID use. Interestingly, NSAID use also was associated with a 50% increase in ischemic stroke. So this led to some comments from academic people. So in the news story, senior author of the sub-study, Dr. Michael Izikowitz said, quote, "Avoid NSAIDs in anticoagulated patients." It's pretty clear. And editorialist Dr. Sam Schulman said telling patients to take acetaminophen is not a solution because most patients say it does nothing for their arthritis because it's not an anti-inflammatory agent. So I used to take this view of the senior academic authors. It was simple. I could just say, avoid NSAIDs because they are dangerous. Now, I actually can't believe it took me so many years to change from this sort of doctor-centered, non-patient-centered point of view. I am now much more open-minded about NSAID use. So I remember one time pontificating about the dangers of NSAIDs on social media when a smart person replied back suggesting the competing dangers of immobility in older patients who have pain. Now that made me think. And add to that the new revelations on the addictive properties of opioids. And finally, and perhaps this is most important, is the problem of concluding dangers of NSAIDs from this sort of observational analysis. So the authors acknowledge many limitations of their paper. First of all, there was no info on dosing. There was no info on reasons for taking nonsteroidals. For instance, baseline data did not capture the presence of inflammatory diseases. The authors dichotomized use or non-use of NSAIDs, and crucially, in some, despite plausibility, we don't know whether patients who took nonsteroidals had more bleeds and ischemic strokes because they were sicker or because of the drug itself. So my new approach to this problem is to first suggest acetaminophen. A lot of its non-effect may be because people think it won't work. I mean, the data on acetaminophen being inferior to nonsteroidals is not clear in my mind. Second thing is I talk about dosing. Nonsteroidal dangers seem to depend on dose. I try to get patients to use less of it. I also discuss the risk of both immobility and the drug's adverse effects, and I no longer just proscribe nonsteroidals because they are dangerous. My gosh, life is dangerous. The final topic today is about end-of-life spending. Atul Gawande made famous a study showing 25% of Medicare spending goes to people in their last year of life. MIT researchers felt that that statistic was flawed because it looked back from death. These researchers designed a study looking forward in the year before one's death, and Science published their study. They used claims data from a random sample to build a machine learning model of annual mortality risk. They then looked at spending on one axis and degree of sickness on the other. And three main findings were that one, authors found no sizable group for whom imminent death was certain. Most who died were actually from the lower risk groups. Secondly, they found that the sickest patients accounted for very small amounts of overall spending. And finally, the spending on the sick explained a great deal. Almost 1/2 of spending on patients who died could be explained by the observation that spending is indeed higher in those with greater predicted mortality. This was a provocative study, and the wrong message to take from these findings is to say, see, look, you less is more people, you can't know who will die, so you can't say that there is low-value care in patients at end of life. But I would come back and say this is a nice study, but it in no way refutes the claim that end-of-life care is often unwise, lacking benefit, inhumane, and costly. We have a very nice news recap on this important study, and I'm proud to say that Dr. Vinay Prasad and I co-wrote an editorial on it. I hope you can take a look at both of these, and please leave any comments that you have. So that's it for this week in cardiology, and I want to just give some announcements. Next week, I'm on family holiday. I'll return after that. When I return, I'll have comments on a very important study in mobile health and detection of atrial fibrillation, and also very interesting findings from a USPSTF review of coronary artery calcium scans. So I'm grateful that you listen. Thank you, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.